There are people who are legitimately disabled, but the reason why they're disabled is because they have bad life habits. They have drug addictions. They have lower back pain because they're obese. They do things that effectively ruin their lives physically, mentally, spiritually, and then they expect people to perpetuate their existence. And I think that's what a lot of people get frustrated by. It's not just a physical issue. It's also like a spiritual, motivational, cultural issue.
And let me just step away from the genetic component of what I asked, but also, as you mentioned, the social component. If there are people, I'm not going to say if. There's a viral video where a woman says, here's the food I make for my 7-year-old. She's morbidly obese, and she's taking a bunch of chicken nuggets, and she's doing like 50 nuggets, and then she's like putting oil on them and then deep frying them, and then she's putting like whipped cream on ice cream. She's like, this is what I give to my kids every day. If you have bad practices outside of genetics, their children are going to be on benefits too. And then a society that says, don't worry, it's fine, we got you. Eventually you get a lot of these people that will create more people. I know fertility is down, but presuming that people are going to have children, they're going to perpetuate that cycle.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, so we have to kind of segregate the conversation here, including, I can kind of include what Conor just said about people with disabilities who might have, maybe it's their fault that they're disabled or something like that. So obviously, if you wanted to say, well, we should have certain rules by which people qualify. Like, obviously, if you were to say, like, oh, I sprained my ankle, so give me $1,000 a month in disability, right? I think most people would say, well, that does sound a little ridiculous, right? And so you might have a list of rules, and every country that has disability benefits has different qualifications, and some things count and some things don't. So, we have to figure out the details here, right? But at the end of the day, what I'm making an argument for is kind of twofold, right? One is the principal argument that we need a welfare state to support people with all of these groups of people, but obviously also inclusive of that, people with disabilities, right? The market fails these people. We cannot leave the market to its own devices. These people will just be poor and in poverty.
Quick interjection. Did you hear about fraternal societies in the early 20th century?
Yeah. I did watch that debate. Okay. My response would just be that I think that people, anarchists who rely on that are, I think, misunderstanding a lot of that history. But
that's being polite. Can you be ruder?
Well, I mean, it kind of goes to your point, though, Conor. When you said that, we need this culture of just like bullying people and telling people to, I hate to say, pick themselves up by their bootstraps, but similarly, like we just need to tell people to like man up, go get a fucking job, right? That kind of thing. Now, I think that in general, we can kind of do a time series here and look at when we didn't have welfare, right? When we didn't have welfare, this kind of culture did exist, and getting welfare benefits was a political trial and experiment. People advocated for it. People shot it down. Eventually we get Social Security. Eventually we get Medicare. Eventually we get Medicaid, all these kind of different things, right? Now, pre-welfare, you saw so much writing like this, right? There was this culture where, oh, if you have to take any money from the government, you're just a bum, lazy piece of garbage or whatever, right? If you have to take money from charity, some conservatives say, oh, well, charities will just fill the gap that welfare takes. Well, back when we had the kind of culture you're describing, people said, even if you take money from charity, you're a bum loser and you shouldn't do that. And charities are in fact bad because it creates the kind of culture that you're talking about. Now, the last thing I was going to say, one last sentence, was that we had that culture and poverty was really high, right? We had a high level of poverty. Once we institute state welfare benefits, guess what? All the people who qualified for them, the poverty rates declined precipitously. They continue to decline all the way up until the 90s and 2000s when benefits kind of bottomed out.
So honest question. Why not let them die?
Well, philosophically, like I said, I mean, I have a kind of intuition about, a sense of community and a value of human life, right? Now, I'm not a religious person, right? So, people have different justifications for their moral views, but, I think just letting somebody with like a disability starve and die and live a worse life, I guess selfishly you could say that by forcing, there was an interesting study about Social Security that talked about this. By having Social Security benefits, for instance, it allows elderly people to live more independently from their parents, or from their, not their parents, from their kids, I should
say.
Yeah, from their families, right? Now, some conservatives might say that that's a bad thing, but then some conservatives...
I was literally about to say that.
But at the same time, a lot of conservatives, like I saw Dennis Prager make a video similar to this, where he said, well, actually, the thing that we want is for people to be individualistic. We want people to kind of atomize. Now, that's a debate in the conservative community. My only point was that by not having these benefits, we create a lot of financial burdens for the broader community. And I don't think that living in a, forcing elderly people to live in the house of their children necessarily means that you have better or worse community. It just means elderly people are living in higher levels of poverty, right? And I think that's just bad.
Or the children live in the house of their parents.
You've kind of steered it for a second, so I want to to steer some of this. Okay, so you actually kind of steered into a point that I wanted to make. So support people who the market does not support. Okay, I am a statist, so ultimately I do believe that women who are raising children are not like drags on our society. They're actually a pro-social component of our society, and it's important that they raise healthy, happy, productive children for all of our sakes, and especially the sake of the future. Now, if we wanted to say, because I feel like we could circle well, there's all these people who actually do deserve these benefits. I think that a actual principled social conservative, if they think about it for 30 seconds, they don't want women to be starving. They don't want the kids to be starving. And they do want people who are productive to kind of get back into society, reintegrated and supported. Okay, I think if a social conservative thinks for more than 30 seconds, they'll do that. Fiscal conservatives, maybe not so much. Now, because they'll say, not with my money. Now, that being said, we're talking about pro-social and anti-social behavior, which I think is like another component of this. We're not just making fiscal arguments. We're not only talking about taxes, debt, all that kind of stuff. The other thing that we're talking about is pro-social stuff. And what's actually interesting is, this is something that I bumped into during research for this, is since the advent of the welfare state, which I guess we could say is like the 40s, I guess, we've actually seen a drop in labor force participation rate, which is effectively people who participate in the economy. But the place where it was most pronounced was actually men over the age of 55. So all the boomers who are telling us, like, pick yourself by the bootstraps, you got to work until you're dead, never take social benefits, blah, 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 blah. If you actually look at it, you see old people effectively stop working as soon as they hit 55, and you see like a 20% decrease. So I wanted to point out that irony, but
why is that ironic? I don't.
Why is it ironic?
You're saying it's ironic for the conservatives.
Because that's the generation that tells us the most that we just need to work our butts off, whereas they are the people who are participating in the economy less and less.
So I have a question. When Social Security was first launched, I believe it was 5 workers were needed to prop up 1 recipient. Based on the scale of benefits and the buying power, as of today, it's 2.1 on average. It's the latest data that goes into paying a Social Security recipient. People on Social Security do not get paid enough to actually sustain a standard of living. And we expect by 2035, Social Security to reach not necessarily insolvency, but the point at which it can only pay out what goes in, which is 77%. So either they have to increase taxes or they have to cut Social Security. Now, on top of this, Gen Z is smaller than the millennials, and Gen Alpha is about half the millennials. Estimated around 40 million people. And to end, if we want to extend the generation by a couple of years, the high estimate may be 48 million.
Yeah.
In 10 years, we are not going to have a labor force that can fund a welfare state.
Sorry, if you'll let me drive for a moment. So this is where we need to change the expectations, at least in my opinion. We're going to have to do this just for survival, okay? We're going to have to reset expectations around what people can materially expect out of the state and what they can expect out of the economy. We are going to have to become extended family units again. We are going to have to work together as a community in order to survive. We are going to have to adopt pro-social behaviors from the early 20th and late 19th century just to survive, because that's an economic calamity that literally, if we try to pay for people to live in 1,400 square foot single family homes by themselves, they're going to end up eating cat food and their pets because they're not going to be able to survive.
On Social Security,
we need to.
Yeah, I mean,
we can't rely on the government benefits. This is effectively like an economic implosion.
Well, I've eaten cat food before.
Cat food.
I have indeed.
In order to survive, or as a joke?
At a party, someone bet $20 for someone to eat cat food, and I did it for free.
It looks suspiciously like tuna, so I mean, it's not impossible.
It literally is tuna, and there's no salt, so it's very bland.
Okay. Well, hold on.
Great.
No one needed to know that.
But I want you to, so Econoboy, what
do you want?
So far, you've argued that the people that I'm targeting or want to target are the parasitic elements of society are not that big of a deal. It's not a big deal. But what Tim kind of
just to be clear, it's not that it's not a big deal in some conceptual sense. It's just that if you just look at the people who are consistently poor, it's all these people who I would say don't exactly exhibit bad behavior, right?
But this is actually Tim kind of brought up a point that I
don't agree with that, but
yeah, Tim brought up a point that I think is very pertinent to the conversation, where effectively, like, it's the conservatives who are pro-natal. We want kids. We want the human species to perpetuate. We're the people who want pro-social behaviors to be implemented over and over and over again, and hopefully we'll be around as a species in 100,000 years. So if we're looking at I don't know what you said, like a 40% cut in the population, something
So
like that.
there are 72 million millennials,
Yeah.
69 million Gen Z,
Okay.
and 40 million Gen Alpha, and Gen Alpha is ending this year. Caveat: Gen Alpha is slightly shorter than previous generations. So if you want to add a few years, because this is based on labor cycles of 18-year-olds, then we could estimate Gen Alpha to be about 48 million. Let's just say the next generation of workers. We're also currently right now facing what's called the demographic cliff, because when the Great Recession happened, a dramatic drop in fertility occurred those 2 years, which means for the next couple of years, we're expecting a major drop off in 18-year-olds. So currently, right now, we're facing a gap of 16 to 18-year-olds. So that's entry-level work and labor for businesses, and we're starting to see businesses actually close because they can't find entry-level labor.
And if you look at the population distribution, there's a natural element to this of the boomers into the X, right? Because the baby boom post World War II, and then X being a smaller generation. However, what I'm saying is if this S curve distribution is going down, then it kind of doesn't matter what we're arguing about from a welfare state perspective. We literally will not be able to afford it without automation, without like extreme amounts of automation.
But real quick, sorry, just a quick point. Automation still is going to be owned by someone, and that means new taxes on automated systems. One proposal is that if Uber intends to fully automate its fleet, they would have to pay a substantial amount of taxes.
Yeah.
People are saying like 30% on top of
effectively payroll tax for robots.
Yes.
Well, yeah, look, I mean, those are many different conversations. I think that we, again, have to segregate the conversation. So fundamentally, even if you have a declining population, and for some reason we don't want to let in immigrants, and obviously I think there's some analysis on that.
We can let in pro-social immigrants. I'm a civic nationalist, ultimately.
My point is, like, even if we were to assume, like, obviously I think immigration is a solution to that problem, especially like in the medium term, essentially. Now, even if we don't agree with that, right? Even if we say, okay, we're not going to let in immigrants and, the population's declining, we still have fundamentally two things that enable the welfare state to exist, right? We have an amount of money and distribution of income in society. There's still going to be workers. There's still going to be people with disabilities, the elderly people, this and that, right? And we're still going to need a way to give them some level of money. Now, obviously, you might say, similar to Japan, right? We might have like a declining population, prices are going down instead of up, deflation's happening, we might need to cut benefits for that reason, or because maybe tax burdens would get so bad for the economy or whatever. Yeah, whatever. That's a very practical conversation. But principally speaking, there's no reason to think that, because we have a declining population, even if we don't let in immigrants, which is the big caveat, and I guess technology doesn't get substantially better, right? So those are two big caveats, that we would obviously just like get rid of like the entirety of the welfare state, or we would substantially cut it back to a quarter of what it was. No, like we would still have a pretty sizable welfare state under those circumstances, and we should.
Thanks for watching this clip from the Culture War podcast. We're live every Friday, 10 a.m. to noon, so subscribe and come hang out.